Elise Thorne watched the freezing rain wash the red courtyard dust from her heavy iron shackles. Her pulse remained remarkably steady. She stood bound to the towering stone judgment pillar in the center of Obsidian Keep, the harsh northern wind pulling at the thin fabric of her linen dress. The cold seeped into her bones, slowing the blood in her veins, but it did not make her shiver. She focused on the physical sensation of the iron cuffs biting into her wrists, letting the dull ache ground her against the deafening noise of the gathered crowd. She was not going to grant the howling pack the satisfaction of a single tear. Marcus Flint stood 3 paces to her right, immovable as the stone beneath his heavy boots. The executioner offered her no glance of malice or pity. He was a creature of strict function, merely waiting for the bureaucratic conclusion of the ritual. In his thick leather-gloved hands, he held the silver blade, its polished surface catching the grey, muted light of the morning. The weapon was a massive ceremonial instrument, designed exclusively for high-tier pack offenders. Its edge sharpened to ensure a clean, lethal strike. Raindrops hit the flat of the metal, shattering into tiny silver beads. Elise tracked the rhythm of those drops. Counting them kept her mind away from the chaotic noise of the courtyard and the biting scent of wet fur that filled the damp air. Directly ahead of the platform, Alpha Garrick Vance paced with restless, aggressive energy. He held a thick roll of parchment in his hand, the execution decree. His voice boomed across the open square, reciting the list of her alleged crimes with a practiced, performative volume that echoed off the high walls of the keep. The heavy rain battered the parchment, threatening to blur the ink, and Garrick gripped the edges so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. He spoke of treason, of espionage, of leaking a highly restricted alliance document. Every word was delivered to the crowd, projected outward to the witnesses, the elders, and the lower-ranking wolves who thrived on the spectacle of a fallen Omega. Yet, for all his loud authority, Garrick completely ignored the woman chained to the pillar. His gaze swept over the crowd, fixed on the stone steps, or lingered on the damp parchment itself, completely avoiding the quiet figure at the center of the stage. Elise observed this avoidance with clinical precision. A truly secure sovereign would meet the eyes of the person he condemned. The Alpha was projecting certainty to mask a deep, frantic incompetence. He was relying on the sheer volume of his decree and the brute force of pack hierarchy to validate his decision, entirely ignoring the missing administrative logic in the accusations he read aloud. Her back remained perfectly straight against the freezing pillar. She controlled her breathing, drawing the sharp, icy air deep into her lungs and exhaling it in a slow, measured stream. The chill of the stone seeped through her clothes, but the silence she wrapped around herself was thicker than any winter cloak. Let the pack scream. Let the Alpha perform his righteous fury. Innocence was not something to be screamed back at a mob. Innocence was a fact, a meticulously kept record, and she knew the actual truth was archived far beyond the reach of Garrick's loud, empty authority. The final words of the decree rang out, hanging heavy in the damp air. The crowd responded with a sudden, vicious roar, demanding blood, demanding the quick justice of Marcus and his blade. Garrick finally stopped pacing. He rolled the wet parchment tightly in his fist and turned, at last forced to face the judgment pillar. He stepped closer to the wooden platform, his broad shoulders tensed under his heavy coat, clearly expecting the inevitable collapse. He expected her to drop to her knees, to strain against the iron chains, to sob and plead for mercy as any condemned Omega facing the block naturally would. Elise did not move. She maintained an unbreakable, silent stare, locking her eyes directly onto his. The roar of the pack faded into a low, restless murmur as the seconds stretched. Her gaze was not filled with desperate longing or frantic terror. It was flat, observant, and entirely empty of the mate bond's natural deference. She looked at him the way an archivist looks at a ledger entry that fails to balance. An error, a miscalculation, a structural flaw that could no longer be ignored. Standing there in the freezing downpour, with her dark hair plastered to her cheeks by the rain, Elise felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The Alpha who had claimed to be her fated partner had not even bothered to cross-examine the timeline of the forgery. He had simply accepted the accusation because it was convenient, because the visual theater of punishing a low-status mate satisfied his fragile ego. The realization did not shatter her. It merely solidified her internal walls, turning the remaining fragments of their biological bond into brittle ice. Garrick's jaw tightened. He took another step forward, the mud squelching beneath his boots. Plumes of white vapor left his mouth with every heavy, aggravated breath, contrasting sharply with Elise's slow, almost invisible exhalations. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper meant only for her, demanding that she confess, demanding that she apologize to the pack before the blade fell. He wanted her verbal submission to validate his terrible choice. She offered him nothing. Her lips remained pressed into a firm, pale line, the cold numbing the surface of her skin. The truth did not require her to beg. It required undeniable evidence, and she knew exactly where the imperial logs lived. She simply let the silence stretch, holding her posture rigid and unyielding, watching the Alpha's performative anger slowly fracture into genuine, creeping unease beneath her steady, unblinking observation. The sudden interruption did not announce itself with a battle cry or the clash of steel, but with the steady, rhythmic grinding of iron-banded wheels against the wet cobblestones of Obsidian Keep. The heavy outer gates, strictly mandated to remain barred during a high-tier sentence, groaned open under the overwhelming pressure of imperial outriders. Through the freezing grey rain, the massive silhouette of a royal carriage cut a path directly through the gathered pack. It moved with an unhurried weight that forced the howling crowd into a breathless silence. The armored horses exhaled thick plumes of white vapor into the bitter morning, their hooves striking the stone courtyard in perfect military unison. At the base of the judgment pillar, Marcus Flint froze. The executioner had already shifted his center of gravity, his grip tightening around the leather-wrapped hilt of the silver blade to prepare for the lethal downward arc. Now, he stood awkwardly suspended in the freezing air, his eyes darting toward the encroaching guard. Garrick Vance stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared as he tried to project the bristling dominance of a local alpha interrupted in his own domain. That fragile illusion of absolute power dissolved the moment the carriage door opened. High King Valerius Sterling stepped down into the winter mud. He wore a heavy, dark velvet cloak lined with frost-pale fur, and his movements were the measured, deliberate actions of a man who inherently owned the ground he walked upon. The entire courtyard oriented toward him, the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. He did not shout commands or demand an explanation. He simply walked toward the execution block, his polished boots stepping cleanly over the slick stones until he stood directly in front of the executioner. The imposing warrior swallowed hard, instinctively lowering his weapon. The sovereign reached out, his gloved fingers hovering over the flat edge of the ceremonial weapon. He did not touch the metal, but his pale eyes tracked the length of the steel in a display of quiet clinical disapproval. A high-tier treason sentence requires a clean, structural severance, Valerius stated. His voice was a low, perfectly modulated baritone that carried through the damp wind without effort. The alloy on this edge is improperly tempered. There is a visible microfracture near the hilt, and the metal itself has not been oiled since the autumn equinox. If you had struck, you would have shattered the bone rather than severing the flesh. It would have been a messy, administratively incompetent execution. Marcus stepped back, his knuckles turning white. "Your Grace," he murmured, his functional mind instantly recognizing the objective truth in the critique. Valerius finally turned his gaze to the rigid alpha. Imperial jurisdiction overrides unilateral pact decrees in all matters involving state espionage, the Sovereign declared, his tone devoid of emotional heat. Your judgment is officially suspended, Alpha Vance. I have come to audit this court. The freezing rain continued to wash the icy dust from Elise Thorne's bound wrists. She watched the exchange with a detached, calculating stillness, noting the exact physiological shift in her former mate. Just moments ago, Garrick had stood as the absolute arbiter of life and death, commanding the courtyard with loud declarations. Now, under the flat, assessing stare of the High King, the Alpha's chest hitched. The aggressive posture he used to intimidate the pack meant nothing to a man who possessed the legal authority to dismantle his territory with a single signature. This is an internal pack matter, Your Grace. Garrick attempted, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. The Omega committed treason against our borders. The evidence is absolute. If the evidence is absolute, it will survive a formal review, Valerius countered smoothly. He glanced up at the heavy grey sky, letting a single drop of rain hit the collar of his cloak. We will not conduct an imperial audit in the mud. The dampness is highly detrimental to parchment, and I require a thorough examination of the original documents. Transfer the prisoner to the inner judicial chamber. The local leader's jaw clenched, but he could not refuse a direct royal command. The pack elders, sensing the sudden shift in the political hierarchy, quickly parted to allow the Imperial guards to take control of the courtyard. And Alpha Vance, Valerius added, pausing just before turning toward the keep's heavy oak doors. Bring me the physical proof of this alleged espionage. I wish to see the document myself. Inside the Grand Hall, the biting northern wind was replaced by the smell of dying embers and cold stone. Elise was escorted inside by 2 armored guards, her iron chains dragging against the polished floor with a dull, rhythmic clatter. She kept her spine perfectly straight, refusing to display the physical exhaustion that gnawed at her muscles. Valerius took his place at the head of the long council table, bypassing the ornate Alpha's chair to stand near the light of the tall windows. He unclasped his heavy cloak, folding it over a bench with precise, deliberate movements. Garrick approached the table, carrying a leather-bound folio. He unrolled the thick parchment, pressing the edges flat against the wood. It was the forged treaty, the very document that had supposedly condemned Elise to death an hour prior. The quiet archivist observed his hands as he smoothed the corners of the paper. They were shaking, not from the lingering adrenaline of the execution, and certainly not from any Miss Plate's grief. His knuckles were white because he was experiencing the specific, paralyzing terror of an administrator who suddenly realized his paperwork was about to be scrutinized by the highest authority in the realm. The grand hall of Obsidian Keep was suffocatingly warm, the massive stone hearth crackling with burning pine and sending the sharp scent of wood resin drifting across the polished floorboards. Elise Thorne stood near the center of the room, her spine locked in perfect vertical alignment. The heavy iron shackles remained tight around her wrists, the frozen metal now weeping cold condensation in the sudden heat. She did not shiver. She simply let the icy water trace slow lines down her skin, her expression giving away absolutely nothing. Before formally addressing the document, Valerius Sterling unclasped his dark velvet cloak, letting the heavy fabric drape over the back of a carved wooden chair. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, creating a quiet gravitational pull that forced the room to orient naturally around him. When the chamber finally settled into a nervous, suffocating hush, the king turned his attention to the older man, standing rigidly by the eastern wall. Joseph Cross gripped the frayed edge of his woolen tunic. The gruff pack archivist had always been a pragmatic figure in the keep, a man whose ink-stained fingers dealt strictly in preserved facts and historical treaties. Now, he was being summoned to testify on the physical security of the restricted records room. The archives, Valerius began, his voice a low, steady current that easily carried to the far corners of the vaulted hall. Explain the mechanism of the brass locks on the eastern wing. The older man swallowed hard, his throat bobbing sharply against his collar. They are standard tumbler locks, Your Grace. Heavy iron casing. Only 2 master keys exist. I hold one, and the chief custodian. He gestured faintly toward the chained woman without quite meeting her gaze. She holds the other. And the secondary entrance? The High King asked, his tone perfectly neutral. Sealed from the inside, the archivist answered quickly, barred with solid oak crossbeams. No one could enter without using the primary doors, and those require the brass key. Only she was in the wing after dusk on the night the Alliance documents were accessed. Elise listened to the testimony with the clinical detachment of a bookkeeper, reviewing a flawed ledger. She did not shout an objection, or plead with the royal witness to see through the deception. Instead, she observed the man she had worked beside for years. She mentally catalogued the minor inconsistencies in his posture. Joseph usually spoke of the archive vaults with rigid pride, sharply correcting anyone who misidentified a classification. Now he slurred his technical terminology. His breathing hitched fractionally on the second syllable of the word sealed. His knuckles, pressed against his sides, were bone-white with strained tension. Most tellingly, the older man shifted his weight entirely to his left boot. Elise recognized that unbalanced adjustment. It was a physical tell he only exhibited when attempting to balance an uneven stack of brittle folios. He was lying, and the underlying pressure violently disrupted his meticulous rhythm. Valerius did not interrupt the stuttering explanation of the night watch schedules. The sovereign simply let the heavy silence stretch after each hurried answer, refusing to offer any conversational relief. The deliberate pauses forced the terrified man to rush his words to fill the void. The gap between factual duty and his current performance left jagged edges of procedural error that anyone with a disciplined mind could spot. Elise catalogued every structural flaw, committing them to memory. She did not need to defend herself out loud. She only needed the king to keep asking precise questions. Valerius reached out and drew the pack's daily security log across the administrative table. He did not look angry, only profoundly disappointed. His long fingers traced the uneven leather binding, pausing over the smeared ink of the date columns and the missing counter-signatures near the bottom margins. The room held its collective breath as the sovereign carefully turned a single page. The dry rasp of stiff parchment sounded unnaturally loud. "This is the official record of your territorial keep," Valerius stated, sliding the open book toward the center of the table so the local leadership could clearly see the chaotic entries. There are no secondary verification stamps from the guard rotation. The wax seals are improperly affixed, allowing pages to be removed or replaced without detection. The ink used for the night watchman's signature changes shade halfway through the week, indicating the log was filled out retroactively. He lifted his gaze, fixing it on the alpha who had orchestrated the morning's execution attempt. "This is not a ledger of a sovereign defense system," Valerius noted with quiet, factual correction. "This is a book of suggestions. Your loose record-keeping is comparable to that of a poorly run tavern. It proves nothing of who actually entered the room, only that your administration is fundamentally compromised." Garrick Vance stepped forward, a low, territorial growl vibrating in his throat. The Alpha was accustomed to ruling through sheer physical presence, using brute hierarchy to silence dissent. He slammed an open palm down onto the oak table, rattling the nearby inkwells in a display of raw force. "My administration is solid," Garrick snarled, his eyes flashing a volatile gold. "The logs are kept by trusted wolves, not mindless clerks. The chain of command is absolute. She had the key, she had the motive, and she was found with the forged treaty hidden in her quarters. You insult the honor of this pack by questioning our internal security." The local leader tried to project absolute dominance, attempting to defend his territory with loud, aggressive posturing, but the gravel bits in his voice sounded like broken teeth under Valerius Sterling's quiet correction. The physical intimidation bounced off the sovereign without leaving a single mark. Valerius did not flinch at the slammed hand. He did not raise his voice to match the aggressive volume. He simply looked at the alpha the way a scholar might look at a misfiled document, an error to be corrected, not a threat to be feared. "Honor," the sovereign repeated softly, the word lacking any warmth or respect. "Honor does not organize a defense strategy. Accountability does, and your accountability is entirely absent." Elise watched the exchange without moving a muscle. The iron chains around her wrists felt remarkably light. She was witnessing the total, systemic collapse of her former mate's authority. Garrick was a creature of raw, unthinking power, unequipped to fight a battle governed by facts, ink, and administrative law. He relied on biological compulsion, missing the reality that the sovereign was dismantling his leadership structure with basic accounting procedures. Garrick shifted his stance, his jaw tight as his usual tactics failed to secure the room. He glared at Elise, as if expecting her to suddenly break down and confess, to validate his brutal judgment by showing weakness. She offered him nothing but an icy, impenetrable stare. She knew the mechanics of justice did not depend on how loud a man could yell. They depended on what could be proven on paper, and in his arrogant haste to condemn her, he had failed to secure the only thing that actually mattered. The heavy oak table at the center of the judicial chamber had already been cleared of everything, except the newly produced documents. Valerius Sterling remained in the high seat, his imposing presence dominating the room. He reached out with gloved hands and unfastened the brass latches of the imperial tax ledger, a massive volume his royal guard had placed before him. The metallic click echoed sharply against the vaulted stone ceiling. When the king opened the cover, the dry whisper of thick vellum filled the silent room. The scent of aged binding glue and cured leather drifted outward, cutting through the damp smell of wet wool, radiating from the local pack members. Valerius delayed, returning his gaze to the forged treaty. He looked at the vast, meticulously recorded columns of regional trade. He was not searching for treason in the abstract. He was mapping the logistical footprint of the territory. Elise Thorne stood a few paces away, her wrists still bound in heavy iron shackles. The cold metal drew the warmth directly from her veins, and the freezing rain from the courtyard continued to drip from the hem of her soaked dress, pooling on the polished flagstones. She did not shiver. Her attention remained locked on the geometry of the room, tracking the subtle shifts in posture among the elite. Garrick stood near the hearth, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of defensive anger and rising confusion. But Elise was not watching him. She was watching Selene Bourne. Selene had positioned herself near the warmth of the fire, her pristine gown completely untouched by the morning storm. She maintained a posture of aristocratic grief, holding a lace handkerchief near her collarbone. Yet, as the sovereign slowly turned another page of the ledger, Elise caught the micro-expression. It was a sudden, tight clenching of the jaw. The delicate muscles beneath Selene's cheek tightened so sharply that the bone structure shifted for a fraction of a second. Valerius turned another page. The slow drag of his gloved index finger down the column of recorded tariffs was the only sound in the chamber. He traced the dates, the merchant seals, the exact weights of imported luxury goods. Elise let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. The High Kingdom tightly regulated the sale and transport of specialized goods, taxing them heavily to track their distribution. Selene's physical rigidity was the reaction of a woman realizing her private purchases were a matter of imperial record. The truth of the conspiracy was not going to be uncovered through a forced confession. It was going to be exposed by basic, undeniable accounting. Elise felt the calm that comes not from hope, but from the mathematical certainty of a well-kept archive. Valerius stopped his finger midway down a newly turned page. He cast no glance toward the local alpha, nor did he address the pack elders, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Instead, the king lifted his gaze and directed his attention entirely to the prisoner standing in the puddle of rainwater. "Tell me about the archival standards of Obsidian Keep," Valerius requested. His voice was a low, unhurried drawl, completely devoid of the aggressive bark typical of a regional enforcer. Specifically, the requisitioned ink used for standard defense logs and daily administration. The entire room stared at him. The local elites exchanged baffled glances. A woman was chained for high treason, and the sovereign was asking for a clerical inventory. Elise did not hesitate. She did not beg for a blanket, and she did not ask for her chains to be removed. She straightened her spine against the heavy drag of the iron, adopting the precise, detached tone of a chief archivist instructing a junior scribe. "Standard pack issue is a basic lamp-black suspension," she answered. Her voice was steady, carrying clearly across the stone hall. "It is manufactured locally using pine soot, distilled water, and a cheap gum Arabic binder. It is highly functional but chemically unstable over long periods." She paused, letting the cold terminology settle. The contrast was stark. A woman soaked to the bone, condemned to die only an hour ago, was delivering a clinical lecture on material science to the highest authority in the land. "Because it is carbon-based," Elise continued. Her gaze locked firmly on the sovereign. Lamp-black ink sits on the surface of the parchment. Under high humidity, such as the climate in this keep, it smudges easily. Over a span of 10 years, it will flake unless stored in a perfectly climate-controlled environment. It is never used for permanent treaties. It is used for temporary guard rosters and minor administrative drafts. The silence that followed her explanation was absolute. The pack elders, who had spent the morning howling for her blood, now sat in mute incomprehension. They were warriors who understood territory, but who knew absolutely nothing about the infrastructure holding their borders together. Garrick frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to grasp the relevance of the recitation. "What does this have to do with the stolen documents?" he demanded, his patience fracturing under a procedure he did not understand. Valerius ignored the interruption completely. He kept his eyes on the chained woman, his expression a mask of quiet focus. "And what is the shelf life of the binding agent before it begins to separate in the bottle?" 6 weeks, Your Grace," Elise replied instantly, "unless it is actively stirred and stored in a dark, cool space. Even then, the local supply frequently crystallizes due to the poor quality of the gum Arabic we are allotted." She recited the exact chemical breakdown and the logistical limitations of the database with the calm authority of a schoolmaster. She ignored the freezing clothes clinging to her skin, refusing to let physical discomfort bleed into her voice. Her intellectual superiority was her actual shield. She was laying bare the administrative ignorance of the men who had sentenced her to death. They had relied on brute force and visual theatrics, entirely unaware of the meticulous reality of the archives she managed. Valerius did not ask for permission to alter the evidence. He reached into the velvet lining of his coat, withdrawing a slender glass vial sealed with a silver stopper. The clear liquid caught the ambient grey light of the judicial chamber. He set the container on the oak table beside the forged treaty. The sound of the glass connecting with the wood was soft, yet it echoed against the stone walls. Elise tracked his movements with quiet calculation. The sovereign's hands were unhurried, lacking the performative urgency that characterized Garrick's hearings. The High King unscrewed the cap. A sharp, astringent scent immediately cut through the damp air, smelling of refined alcohol and crushed minerals. A sterile, clinical odor that banished the lingering scent of wet wool and fear. He withdrew a thin glass pipette, drawing a precise measure of the clear fluid up into the tube. "You cannot do this." The sudden protest fractured the quiet. Celine stood rigid beside the alpha, the silk of her gown rustling as she shifted her weight. Her manicured fingers gripped the wooden witness railing, her knuckles pressing bone-white against her pale skin. Treating a sworn pact document with foreign imperial chemicals is a direct violation of our sovereignty, Celine stated, her tone pitched a fraction too high. The laws of Obsidian Keep dictate that internal evidence must remain untouched by outside hands. If you alter the physical integrity of the parchment, you invalidate the trial. Elise remained perfectly still in her heavy iron chains. She recognized the tactic instantly. It was a desperate administrative defense, an attempt to use bureaucratic technicalities to shield a crumbling lie. Celine was no longer arguing about treason. She was arguing about territorial jurisdiction. The archivist noted the slight tremor in the rival's left hand, betraying an undeniable panic. She had never accounted for the cold mechanics of a sovereign audit. Garrick turned his head toward the woman at his side, a heavy line of confusion appearing between his dark brows. He looked at her flushed face, then back at the testing equipment. He did not endorse her territorial claim, his silence hanging unresolved in the tense chamber. Valerius continued his preparation without pause. He held the pipette perfectly steady above the parchment, his attention focused entirely on the angle of the glass. The Treaty of the High North, Section 4, Article 9, the king recited. His voice remained a low, measured drawl, occupying the space without the nervous impulse to fill it with volume. In cases involving treason against the imperial crown, all local evidentiary rules are superseded by the sovereign audit. The crown retains the right to verify the material nature of any document claiming to contain state secrets. He lifted his chin, his pale eyes resting briefly on the woman standing beside the local leader. Unless you are suggesting that this specific court has something to hide from the crown, Lady Celine. Celine's mouth opened to form an objection, then snapped shut. She swallowed hard, her hand reaching out to clutch Garrick's dark sleeve. But the man simply stared at the clear liquid trapped inside the tube. His square jaw was locked tight, his broad shoulders rigid under the weight of his fur cloak. He offered his future bride no verbal protection against the imperial edict. The High King returned his gaze to the table, dismissing the objection completely. The legal defeat was absolute. With the legal objection dismantled, the sovereign returned his attention to the parchment spread across the oak boards. Elise watched the mechanics of the impending test with detached interest. She knew the chemical properties of standard carbon-based soot ink perfectly well. It was cheap, abundant, and immune to most liquid solvents. If the document had been written with the supplies kept in the archives, the clear liquid would simply soak into the raw paper fibers without changing the dark letters. Valerius positioned the tapered tip of the pipette directly over the primary signature line. His hand was motionless, an anchor of absolute stability in a room vibrating with unsaid tension. With a microscopic shift of his thumb, he applied a single drop. The liquid struck the rough parchment with a faint sound. For a span of 3 heartbeats, absolutely nothing happened. The droplet sat pooled on the surface of the paper, acting as a tiny magnifying glass over the sharp lines of handwriting beneath it. Elise tracked the slow absorption, her breathing evening out into a flat rhythm, her spine held straight against the dragging weight of the iron binding her wrists. Then the chemical reaction began. The dark ink did not merely smear. It did not fade into a muddy grey puddle. Instead, the sharp edges of the black lettering began to bloom. A vivid, unmistakable violet colour bled violently outward from the lines, spreading like a bright bruise across the pale surface of the parchment. The sharp alcohol scent in the air suddenly mingled with a distinct metallic odour, the undeniable olfactory signature of oxidized iron and imported gallnuts. The violet stain expanded outward, stark and brilliant under the ambient light of the judicial chamber. It was a chemical impossibility for common soot ink to produce such a hue. It was absolute, material proof of forgery, written in a highly specialized substance far too expensive for a discarded archivist to ever acquire. Garrick leaned forward. The Alpha placed both of his scarred hands flat against the edges of the table, his massive frame suddenly entirely focused on the expanding purple circle. He stared at the color change, as if the ink itself were a physical blade cutting cleanly through his constructed reality. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed terribly in the silent room. The heavy muscles in his forearms went rigid, the silver rings on his fingers digging deep into the polished wood as he braced his weight against the truth. He stared at the blooming violet stain, and then, very slowly, his gaze dragged upward from the ruined parchment to look at the woman standing in chains. Elise met his eyes directly across the length of the room. She did not lean forward to close the distance. She did not offer a vindicated smile, nor did she present a tearful plea for recognition. She simply looked at him, experiencing the specific ache born of harsh validation rather than shock. The reality of his failure was a fundamental collapse of his duty as a leader. He had never bothered to investigate. He had not questioned the logistical discrepancies in the accusation. He had merely looked at a piece of paper, listened to the honeyed whispers of his new betrothed, and dragged his former mate to the judgment pillar to die in the freezing rain. He had allowed his arrogant reliance on visual hierarchy to override his foundational responsibilities to the truth. The Alpha's broad chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements. The absolute certainty that had carried him through the morning was fracturing in real time before the entire assembly. The violet stain bleeding into the table was not just ink. It was the documented, irreversible proof of his blindness. Valerius set the empty glass pipette down on a folded square of clean linen. He did not raise his voice to declare an early victory. He simply let the terrible silence stretch, allowing the physical evidence to do the screaming for him. Breaking the stillness, High King Valerius Sterling tapped the open pages of the imperial tax ledger against the long oak table. The impact sent a dull, resonant thud echoing through the judgment chamber. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of winter light that pierced the high, narrow windows, catching the faint scent of dried binding glue and aged vellum. He ran a black-gloved finger down the dense columns of numerals. He did not rush the motion. The sovereign occupied the space around him, with absolute, terrifying patience, reading the administrative records. With the solemnity of a priest consulting a sacred text, she observed the document, the precise alignment of the merchant stamps, the meticulous accounting of border tolls. This was the language she spoke, the quiet, irrefutable language of recorded truth that stood immune to the emotional whims of pack hierarchy. Valerius stopped on a particular line, his finger tapping the paper once. The chamber held its breath. Garrick stood rigidly near the hearth, his jaw tight, his broad shoulders tense, as his eyes darted between the sovereign and the document. The Alpha was a man of brute force, raised to respect physical dominance. He possessed no defense against the cold, unyielding architecture of mathematics and trade law. According to the regional shipping manifests dated exactly 3 weeks prior to the creation of the forged alliance document. Valerius continued, reading the script with a measured, rhythmic cadence. Only a single merchant caravan crossed the mountain border, carrying this restricted material. The shipment consisted of 4 sealed vials. The destination recorded by the tollmaster was not the central pack archives. It was not the Alpha's official administrative study. The High King looked up from the ledger, his pale, analytical gaze bypassing Garrick entirely to find the woman standing near the back of the dais. The bill of lading is signed, stamped, and paid for by the private estate of Lady Celine Bourne. The name dropped into the suffocating silence like a stone into freezing water. Garrick turned slowly, his heavy boots scraping against the uneven flagstones to look at his new betrothed. Celine's perfect posture faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Her knuckles whitened where she gripped the heavy velvet folds of her gown. The color drained completely from her cheeks, leaving her face the dull shade of old ash. "That is impossible," Garrick said, the words lacking his usual commanding volume. He looked back at the ledger, then at the sovereign, completely unmoored by the physical evidence presented before him. There must be a mistake in the registry, a clerical error made at the crossing. The High Kingdom does not make clerical errors regarding restricted imports, Alpha Garrick Vance, Valerius replied, his tone devoid of any comforting inflection. He turned the heavy page of the ledger, the dry rustle sounding incredibly loud in the quiet hall. The tax stamps match the dates of transport. The signature on the receipt is verified by the border magistrate. 4 vials of violet iron-gall ink were delivered directly to the southern wing of Obsidian Keep, into the personal custody of your future Luna. Elise let that knowledge settle into her chest, slow, thorough, filling every crack of the humiliation she had endured out in the freezing rain. The chains around her wrists were still heavy, the iron still biting into her cold skin, but the balance of power in the room had fundamentally shifted. The weapon that would clear her name was not a desperate plea, but a column of numbers written in black ink. Celine stepped forward, her movements abruptly losing their previous fluid, aristocratic grace. Panic, sharp and unrefined, began to bleed through her carefully constructed mask. She gestured wildly toward the chained archivist, her voice rising in pitch as she attempted to reclaim the narrative through sheer volume. "She stole it," the noblewoman accused, pointing a trembling finger at Elise Thorne. "She is the Pax record keeper, is she not? She has unrestricted access to every corridor in the keep. She must have broken into my private study, stolen the ink, and forged the document to frame me when she realized Garrick no longer wanted her." The room murmured, the peripheral pack members easily swayed by loud emotions and dramatic accusations. Garrick's expression shifted slightly. His posture leaning toward the lifeline Celine had thrown him. It was vastly easier for his pride to believe in a jealous Omega's calculated sabotage than to face his own catastrophic failure of judgment. Elise did not pull against her chains. She did not raise her voice to match her accuser's rising hysteria. She simply looked at the frantic woman, struck by the grim ache of having her worst suspicions about a rotten system fully validated. "That would be a highly plausible theory," Elise said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the murmurs with the cold precision of a medical instrument. She paid no attention to her former mate. Her focus remained entirely on the architectural reality of the evidence. If the imported ink had been stored in a standard glass vial on a shelf, but it was not. Valerius tilted his head slightly, yielding the floor to her. He did not interrupt, silently offering her the space to construct her own defense, using the very administrative system she had dedicated her life to maintaining. "Celine's private inkwell is a commissioned piece," he explained, the administrative details flowing from her memory with flawless, mechanical accuracy. "It is forged from solid brass and fitted with a localized spring-loaded wardlock mechanism. I know this, because I personally logged the artisan's invoice for its creation 2 months ago." Celine's breath caught audibly in the quiet chamber. Her hand twitched, rising instinctively toward her collarbone, before she forcefully wrenched it back down to her side. The inkwell cannot be opened by blunt force without shattering the internal glass lining and destroying the contents. Elise continued, her gaze dropping pointedly to the high neckline of her rival's dress. "It requires a bespoke, dual-pronged key. A key that the artisan explicitly documented was forged only once, with no duplicates permitted. A key that you have worn on a silver chain around your neck since the hour it was delivered." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Every eye in the judicial chamber moved slowly from the chained prisoner to the polished noblewoman. Celine took a physical step backward, her hand flying up to clutch her chest, inadvertently pressing against the hidden, ridged shape of the key, beneath her velvet bodice. The panicked gesture was a confession rendered in bone and muscle, far more damning than any spoken word could ever be. "Are you suggesting," Valerius asked, his voice a soft, dangerous murmur that promised severe consequences, "that the archivist not only bypassed your personal guard rotation, but also removed a key from your living person, unlocked the brass mechanism, drafted a flawless forgery, locked the vessel, and returned the key to your neck without you waking?" Celine opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her eyes darted wildly toward the heavy oak doors, searching for an ally in a room that had suddenly grown very cold. Garrick stared at his betrothed, his chest heaving as the reality of the mechanical impossibility crushed his final desperate defense. He had sentenced his fated mate to death, based on a lie so poorly constructed it could not survive a single imperial inquiry. Elise stood perfectly still, the cold iron biting into her wrists. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Now, watching the architect of her destruction unravel over a brass lock and a silver chain, she found she had no tears left to give, only the absolute, chilling clarity of vindication. The temperature in the great hall seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Valerius Sterling shifted his gaze from the sputtering noblewoman to the man standing rigidly near the edge of the hearth. Joseph Cross, the older archivist, had built a comfortable life on the quiet, unassailable safety of the Pax record rooms. He was a pragmatist who survived by aligning himself with whichever faction held the most leverage. For decades, the clerk had managed the flow of information, deciding what was written and what was conveniently lost. But right now, the leverage had shifted entirely out of the Pax jurisdiction and into the terrifying, absolute machinery of the sovereign crown. The High King did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Valerius simply recited the imperial statute governing the falsification of a sovereign alliance. He outlined the penalty with clinical precision. It was not a quick, honorable strike from the silver blade in a muddy courtyard. The punishment for imperial treason involved the complete administrative erasure of a bloodline, the immediate confiscation of all family assets, and a slow, heavily documented execution in the capital's deepest cells. The weight of that legal reality settled over the room like a physical crushing force. Joseph's pragmatism fractured. The gruff mentor, Elise Thorne, had once respected, began to physically tremble. The tremor started in his ink-stained fingers and travelled up his arms, curling his shoulders inward. It stripped him of whatever dignity his grey robes afforded. He was no warrior willing to die for a romanticized lie. He was merely an administrator who had vastly miscalculated the cost of a bribe. His breath hitched, harsh and ragged. He reached a shaking hand deep inside the heavy wool of his coat. "I did not write the treason," Joseph stammered, his voice cracking violently in the stillness. "I only gave her the access. I only opened the door to the lower vaults." He pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined pouch and upended it over the center of the long oak table. Gold spilled across the wood. The coins chimed against the polished grain, a heavy, solid sound that echoed off the stone walls. They did not bear the crude, uneven stamp of the local northern territories. As the firelight caught the metal, it illuminated the distinct, intricate mint marks of the imperial treasury. They were freshly pressed, flawlessly weighted, and entirely undeniable. "She paid me." The old man pointed a trembling, desperate finger at the woman in silk. "Celine Bourne paid me to leave the archive door unlocked during the winter solstice festival. She paid me to alter the patrol ledgers so the lower corridors appeared empty. I just looked the other way." Lady Celine lunged forward, her teeth bared, screeching that the archivist was a liar, a pathetic traitor trying to save his own miserable skin. But the terrified clerk did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on the sovereign, frantically attempting to trade his complicity for royal clemency. His breakdown contained no moral awakening, no sudden remorse for the young Omega he had condemned to the judgment pillar. It was driven by pure, unadulterated financial and legal self-preservation. Elise watched the imperial gold catch the ambient light. She absorbed the bitter sting of inevitability rather than the shock of betrayal. The man who had taught her how to bind parchment, how to properly trim a quill, and how to preserve the absolute truth in ink, had sold her life for a handful of stamped metal. The frantic clerk was not finished. Desperation loosened his tongue, spilling the exact mechanics of the conspiracy onto the table for the imperial court to document. She needed the handwriting to match perfectly, Joseph continued, his breathing shallow and rapid. She ordered me to bring her a dozen old requisition forms. Old supply orders that the former archivist had signed months ago. I delivered them to her private study. I watched her trace the letters. He gestured frantically toward the forged treaty resting under the candlelight. The mentor mapped out the precise flaws in the deception, eager to prove his usefulness to the crown. The noblewoman spent weeks practicing the loops of the signature late at night. The old man babbled, sweat beading on his forehead. But she did not understand the structural formatting. She drafted the treasonous text using the syntax of a high-born letter, not the rigid administrative shorthand of a certified keeper of records. The margins are too wide. The date stamp is placed on the right, but pack registry law dictates all official external correspondence must be dated on the left. He swallowed hard, stepping back from the table. I told her the formatting was wrong, but she said the Alpha would never notice. She said he only looked at what she wanted him to see. The silence that followed those words was absolute. Garrick Vance stood frozen at the head of the table. He stared down at the violet ink drying on the heavy parchment. His chest barely moved. The arrogant certainty that had defined his posture all morning evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, brittle shell. He had sentenced his fated mate to death based on a piece of paper he had barely scrutinized. He had trusted his own infallible judgment, believing himself the absolute authority who protected his territory from unseen threats. Instead, his entire sense of command was nothing more than a puppet theater managed by a manipulative interloper's schemes. Garrick looked at the woman he had chosen to elevate. Celine's beautiful, perfectly composed mask had completely shattered, replaced by the ugly, panicked snarl of a cornered animal. She was screaming insults at the clerk, denying the structural evidence, demanding that her partner defend her honor. But the Alpha of the Obsidian Keep did not move to protect her. The crushing weight of his pride collapsed inward. He realized, with sickening clarity, that he was not a brilliant leader uncovering a deep spy ring. He was an administratively incompetent fool who had been effortlessly manipulated by the woman sharing his bed. His grand authority had been undone by wide margins and a misplaced date stamp. He slowly turned his head to look at Elise. He expected to see triumph in her eyes, or perhaps the vindictive joy of a woman proven right. But her expression remained completely unreadable. She stood there, her bruised wrists resting against the dark fabric of her dress, viewing him not with anger but with the cold, clinical pity reserved for a man who had destroyed his own house. The absolute silence in the chamber was no longer the quiet of anticipation, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a collapsed reality. The freezing rain outside continued to lash against the high, stained glass windows, magnifying the tension indoors. The scent of wet wool still clung to the air, mingling with the sharp, acidic tang of the chemical testing agent left on the central table. Garrick Vance stood frozen under Elise's unreadable gaze. The arrogance that usually held his shoulders square, the unquestioned territorial authority that defined his every movement, had completely evaporated. He looked down at the floorboards, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts as the full weight of the High King's evidence crushed his remaining worldview. The forged treaty, the chemical reaction, the confession. It all pointed to his catastrophic failure of judgment. He took a slow, unsteady step toward her. The sound of his leather boot scraping against the stone floor was deafening in the total quiet of the hall. "Elise," he whispered. It was not a command. It was a jagged, hollow sound, completely stripped of its former territorial pride. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, stopping mere inches from the cold iron links binding her arms. He wanted to apologize, to somehow undo the irreversible damage of the morning. His posture screamed of a man desperate to bridge the immense chasm his own blind trust in Celine had carved between them. He wanted her to look at him, to offer some flicker of the mate bond they shared, to grant him a single foothold back into her good graces. Elise Thorne did not lean away from his outstretched hand, nor did she flinch. She simply turned her head, fixing her gaze on the damp stone of the opposite wall. Her posture remained perfectly straight, her shoulders carrying the weight of the chains without a tremor. She endured the cold hollow of verified disappointment, lacking any trace of astonishment. She did not hate him in that moment. Hate required energy. Hate required an active, burning investment in his continued existence. Instead, she watched the total ruin of his pride with the clinical detachment of an archivist, filing a dead record into the dark vaults. He had chosen visual appearances and high-born social influence over her meticulous, quiet loyalty. Now, seeing him choke on the ashes of his own foolishness, she found absolutely no joy. There was no triumphant satisfaction blooming in her chest, no gloating heat to warm her against the winter chill. There was only the quiet, icy reality settling into her bones. He was exactly the man she had always calculated him to be. He was reactive, incompetent, and easily manipulated by anyone wearing a silk dress. The silence between them stretched out, deeper and colder than the northern wind, offering him no comfort, no reassurance, and absolutely no absolution. The heavy silence in the judicial chamber shattered with the frantic scrape of chair legs against the wooden floorboards. Celine Bourne, completely stripped of her aristocratic composure, bolted. Her heavy silk skirts tangled around her ankles as she spun away from the central table. Her eyes locked wildly on the heavy oak doors. The polished veneer of the confident betrothed was entirely gone, replaced instantly by the raw, panicked instinct of a cornered animal, realizing the trap had irrevocably snapped shut. She did not look back at Garrick. She did not cast a second glance at the damning purple stain of the iron gall ink. She only calculated the geometry of her escape. She did not make it 3 steps. The movement was barely a blurb before Valerius Sterling's imperial guards shifted in perfect, silent synchronization. They did not shout warnings or draw their weapons in a loud display of brute force. They simply closed the spatial geometry of the room, their armored bodies moving like a seamless wall of cold iron and dark fabric, instantly sealing off the space between Celine and the doors. They did not need to issue commands. Their presence alone was an absolute barrier. Their efficiency was a stark, disciplined contrast to the reactive chaos that governed the local pack. But it was not just the Imperial guards who moved to end the flight. Marcus Flint, who had stood like a carved statue holding the silver blade, ever since the tribunal moved indoors, finally shifted his weight. The executioner's face, usually an empty mask of purely functional duty, contorted with a quiet, sickening realization. He looked at the heavy, ceremonial weapon in his hands, then at the quietly dignified Omega he had nearly slaughtered on the courtyard pillar. His strict, unquestioning adherence to the letter of the decree had been weaponized by a petty, status-driven conspiracy. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus stepped directly into Celine's path. He did not raise the silver blade to threaten her, but he turned his broad shoulders, physically blocking her retreat with his sheer mass. When Celine looked up at him, her chest heaving, Marcus stepped away from her in absolute disgust. He refused to even acknowledge her presence, treating her as if she were a foul disease on the wind. He oriented his stance toward Valerius, lowering his head slightly, signaling his quiet, ashamed submission to the High King's supreme authority. Seeing their executioner yield, The rest of the pack's military elite finally understood how deeply their hierarchy had been compromised. They offered no resistance. They simply stood down, stepping back against the walls, allowing the imperial administration to finish cleaning the rot from their own house. The heavy oak doors of the inner judicial chamber seemed to seal the sudden, profound silence that followed the pack's submission. Valerius Sterling stood at the head of the long administrative table, his posture and architecture of absolute authority. He did not raise his voice to command the room. He merely rested his gloved fingertips against the rough parchment of the forged treaty, letting the damning violet ink dry under the ambient light of the hearth. The sovereign king turned his gaze toward the center of the chamber. Elise Thorne remained perfectly still as the imperial declaration was prepared, her steady breathing acting as a stark contrast to the chaotic whispers that had just died down. Not a tremor shook her shoulders. Not a flicker of relief broke the cold, methodical assessment in her dark eyes. Based on the regional import logs, the charge of high treason against this archivist is formally dissolved. The evidence of espionage was manufactured. The words settled in the warm air of the hall, like stones dropped into still water. The surrounding pack members, who only hours ago had howled for her blood in the freezing rain, now shifted uneasily. Their boots scuffed against the polished stone floor. They looked at each other, realizing the terrifying weight of their collective error. Valerius did not look at the murmuring crowd. He looked only at the heavy iron shackles still binding the wrists of the woman before him. "The prisoner is fully exonerated," the king continued, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceiling. "Release her." At those words, the rigid hierarchy of the local court fractured. Alpha Garrick Vance moved before anyone else could react. His chest he heaved with ragged breaths as he crossed the distance from the high seat to the center floor. He moved with the desperate, erratic energy of a man trying to outrun a collapsing foundation. Garrick carried the heavy iron ring of keys that belonged to the executioner's block. His knuckles were bone-white as he gripped the metal, his usually impeccable composure shattered by the reality of the ledger's proof. He wanted to be the one to undo the damage he had authorized. He needed to physically remove the cold iron from her bruised skin, as if the act of turning a key could rewind the morning's fatal decree. Elise watched him approach. She sensed the familiar, dull ache of a letdown she had long anticipated. The man who had sentenced her to face the silver blade was now rushing to play the savior, desperate to erase the stain of his own gullibility. His eyes were wide, pleading silently for a forgiveness she had long since categorized as irrelevant. The heavy iron key slid toward the rusted lock on her right wrist. Garrick Vance reached out, his hand trembling slightly, his scent thick with the sour ozone of panic and belated regret. He anticipated a sigh of relief. He expected the traditional Omega submission, the tearful gratitude of a mate pulled back from the edge of oblivion. Instead, Elise Thorne physically pulled her hands back. The movement was not a frantic jerk of fear, nor was it a violent thrashing of anger. It was a calculated, deliberate withdrawal, precise enough to keep the heavy chains from rattling against the stone floor. She stepped half a pace backward, putting exactly 2 feet of empty, undeniable space between her bruised wrists and his extended hands. Garrick froze, the key hovering uselessly in the air. The silence in the chamber thickened into something suffocating. The Alpha blinked, his jaw working silently as he stared at the empty space where her hands had been seconds before. He looked up at her face, searching for a crack in her composure, finding only the impenetrable surface of a frozen lake. "No," Elise said. The single syllable was not shouted, but it cut through the room with the devastating clarity of breaking glass. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain the depth of the betrayal, nor did she outline the administrative failure of his leadership. She simply refused his touch. "Elise," Garrick whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "Let me take them off, please." She did not look at his face again. Her attention shifted smoothly, respectfully, over his shoulder. She looked directly at the towering figure of Valerius Sterling, who watched the interaction with the quiet intensity of a lodestone, orienting a compass needle. "Your Grace," the archivist addressed the sovereign, her tone as measured as if she were requesting a new requisition of parchment. "As this tribunal now falls under imperial jurisdiction, I request that imperial personnel process my release." Valerius held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. He understood the legal and emotional boundary she was drawing in the cold stone room. He gave a single, slow nod. At his unspoken command, a heavily armored imperial guard stepped forward, his boots thudding rhythmically against the stone. The soldier approached the disgraced Alpha, extending a gauntleted hand. Garrick stared at the guard, then back at the woman he had nearly killed, his chest tight with a sudden, suffocating realization. Elise's refusal was quiet, but absolute. The pack watched in total stillness, finally understanding the true cost of their Alpha's arrogance. Garrick's fingers went slack. The iron keys slipped from his grip, falling into the guard's outstretched palm. They clinked sharply in the silence, the harsh metallic sound echoing through the hall as the final, undeniable proof that she would never let him close again. The heavy iron cuffs fell to the stone floor with a dull metallic clang, leaving angry red bands on her pale wrists. Elise rubbed the chafed skin, her movements unhurried and precise. The biting chill of the metal lingered, but the oppressive weight of the chains was finally gone. Her arms felt buoyant and terrifyingly light. The judicial chamber of Obsidian Keep silent, save for the crackle of the great hearth fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the Alpha standing a few paces away. Garrick took a hesitant half-step forward. His hand reached out in a gesture of desperate, belated reconciliation. He wanted a tearful exchange where he could grovel on his knees, plead his ignorance, and eventually yield to the primal pull of their connection. But Elise offered him nothing of the sort. She looked at him with the flat clinical appraisal of a master archivist, examining a corrupted parchment, an error to be corrected, a flawed entry to be stricken from the record. "Garrick Vance," Elise began, her voice remarkably steady. It did not echo with supernatural resonance, nor did it break with sorrow. It carried the dry, absolute tone of an official executing a property deed cancellation. "By the documented laws of the High Kingdom and the archaic statutes of the Obsidian Pack, I stand before this tribunal as a free woman, wrongly accused and fully exonerated by imperial measure." His eyes widened in horror as he recognized the formal cadence of her words. "Elise, no, don't do this. I was blind, I was completely manipulated, but I am still your fated mate." "A mate is a partner in administration, in truth and in survival," Elise interrupted, her tone entirely devoid of warmth. "You are none of these things. You have proven yourself administratively incompetent, easily deceived, and morally compromised. Therefore, I invoke the ancient right of severance, not as a wounded heart, but as a sovereign individual, terminating a nullified contract." She raised her scarred hands, turning her palms upward. The pack elders shifted uneasily, recognizing the gravity of the legalistic rejection. She was dismantling it piece by piece, through the rigid protocols of the law, using the very structures they claimed to uphold. "I, Elise Thorne, claim full dominion over my own blood, my own breath, and my own future," she stated, enunciating each syllable with perfect clarity, so the scribes would record it without error. "I revoke your access to my loyalty. I strip your name from my lineage. I declare the bond between us void, illegitimate, and permanently sealed away, effective immediately before these witnesses." The words settled into the chamber like heavy stones dropping into still water. She had long ago mastered the art of withholding her tears from those incapable of grasping her sorrow. Now, she delivered her justice with the precision of ink on parchment. She simply erased him from her ledger. The silence following her declaration was absolute, stretched so thin it felt fragile, Then, deep within the unseen architecture of the room, something gave way. It was not a magical surge or a theatrical display of supernatural light. It was a quiet, heavy sound, like a thick branch snapping under an iron boot, the physical rupture of a fated mate bond. Garrick let out a sudden, suffocating gasp. The colour drained entirely from his face as his hands flew to his chest. His knees buckled under the crushing absence, and he collapsed onto the hard stone floor. The impact echoed sharply against the polished rock. He writhed, pulling his knees toward his stomach. Gasping for air, his lungs suddenly refused to hold. The agony of a broken soul tie tore through his nervous system, reducing the proud Alpha to a trembling figure at her feet. Elise remained standing, perfectly still, her posture straight. She braced herself for the mirrored pain, expecting the devastating agony that was said to cripple both parties when a fated bond was severed. She waited for the tearing sensation, the crushing weight in her chest. Instead, she felt nothing but a sudden, profound rush of quiet air. It started in the center of her chest and expanded outward, a cool sensation that flooded her lungs. For the first time in her adult life, Elise inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of burning cedar from the hearth and the crisp ozone of the northern rain outside. It felt as if she had spent her entire existence breathing through a restrictive straw, her lungs compressed by the heavy demands of a mate who had only ever drained her energy. Now, the straw was gone. The snapping of the bond did not bring the tragic loss she had been taught to fear. It brought a miraculous physical liberation. It was the distinct sensation of a severe fever finally breaking, the sudden return of absolute health after a long, exhausting illness. She experienced the hollow clarity of an expected truth, the realization that the mystical bond had never been a sanctuary, only a cage designed to keep her small. She looked down at Garrick as he wheezed on the stone, his fingers clutching desperately at his own ribs. He was drowning in the void she had left behind, suffocating on the loss of her presence while she stood above him, finally breathing the air he had hoarded for so long. She did not feel the urge to kneel beside him or offer comfort. The emotional architecture that had once bound her to his well-being was simply gone, wiped away like chalk dust from a slate. Elise lowered her hands, letting them rest comfortably at her sides. She stood tall, her shoulders relaxed and steady, watching the broken man with the detached interest of a passerby, observing a fallen tree blocking a dirt road. The tribunal chamber was utterly still, every elder and imperial guard holding their breath, their eyes fixed on the woman who had just amputated a piece of her own soul and emerged undeniably whole. The heavy silence following the severed bond was unbroken by anyone in the Obsidian Keep. The pack members stood frozen, their lungs barely pulling in the damp, rain-soaked air drifting through the high arches. Valerius Sterling did not look at the collapsed Alpha on the floor. The High King's attention remained entirely fixed on the woman standing before him. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, his boots making soft, measured sounds against the cold stone. Reaching inside the heavy velvet folds of his traveling cloak, he withdrew a rolled parchment, sealed with the silver crest of the imperial court. He did not offer a hand of comfort. He did not offer an apology on behalf of the kingdom. He offered a document. Elise Thorne watched the thick vellum unroll in his gloved hands. The scent of melted beeswax and aged pine drifted upward, cutting through the metallic tang of rain and fear that choked the pack hall. Valerius smoothed the edges of the parchment with clinical precision. He was a man who understood that true salvation was never found in a romantic rescue. It was found in ironclad legal parameters. The imperial archives in the capital are currently in a state of unacceptable disarray, Valerius stated, his voice low and devoid of unnecessary inflection. The previous administrator lacked the meticulous discipline required to manage the high ledgers. I have reviewed your apothecary logs, your supply records, and your flawless documentation of this territory's trade routes. He turned the document so she could read the precise black script. It was a formal contract of employment. I am offering you the position of chief custodian of the imperial archives. The king continued, his tone carrying the weight of a sovereign decree rather than a charitable whim. This role reports directly to the crown. It includes a private study lined with cedar in the eastern wing, complete sovereignty over the lower clerks, and an independent salary drawn from the royal treasury. Your jurisdiction will supersede any regional pack authority. Elise let her eyes track over the neat columns of ink. The contract said nothing of pack loyalty, mate bonds, or biological obligations. It demanded only her intellect. Valerius did not crowd her space or expect immediate gratitude. He was not asking her to be a decorative possession. He was asking her to manage his empire's history. This was not a sanctuary granted out of pity. It was a transaction built on undeniable evidence of her competence. Let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. I require a quill, Elise said. Her voice was perfectly steady, free of the ragged exhaustion that typically followed a public trial. One of the imperial guards immediately stepped forward, producing a portable brass inkwell and a fresh feather. Elise took the quill, her scarred fingers gripping the thin barrel with practiced ease. She did not hesitate. She signed her name at the bottom of the vellum, the sharp scratching of the nib echoing clearly across the silent room. The black liquid settled quickly into the heavy fibers. Valerius rolled the parchment, securing it safely within his cloak, finalizing the agreement. At his silent nod, the imperial guards shifted their formation. The heavy iron chains that had been unlocked from Elise's wrists only moments ago were scooped up from the floor. The cold metal clattered harshly against the masonry. 2 armored men marched directly toward the far corner of the hall, where Celine Bourne was attempting to shrink into the shadows of the tapestries. "No," Celine whispered, her voice cracking as a guard seized her arms. "No, you cannot do this. I am to be Luna." The guards did not speak. They clamped the heavy iron cuffs around Celine's delicate wrists. The locking mechanism engaged with a brutal, definitive snap. Celine collapsed to her knees, her elaborate silk gown dragging through the dust and dampness of the floor. She began to weep violently, her chest heaving as she screamed for mercy, looking frantically toward the pack elders who simply averted their eyes. Beside her, Joseph Cross was hauled to his feet. The gruff archivist offered no resistance, his shoulders sagging in absolute defeat as the chains were secured around his own wrists. Elise stood beside the king, watching the spectacle with cold academic distance. The betrothed was crying loudly, pouring her terror out into the open air, begging for someone to care. She had endured years, training herself to suppress her grief before unsympathetic audiences. Celine had never learned that lesson. The beautiful, high-born woman thought her distress would command a rescue, but the imperial guards simply hauled her upward, their expressions blank. The world did not stop for a woman's tears. "Move," the lead guard commanded, giving the chain a sharp yank. Celine stumbled forward, choking on her own sobs, dragging the disgraced Joseph behind her. They were paraded through the center of the hall, right past the spot where Elise had stood facing execution just an hour before. Elise did not smile. She did not gloat. She merely adjusted the sleeves of her simple linen dress, her posture perfectly straight. The weeping faded as the heavy oak doors of the keep were pulled open, letting in a gust of freezing northern rain before slamming shut behind the prisoners. The room was finally clean. Garrick Vance scrambled to his feet, his boots slipping against the polished stone floor. The sharp echo of his frantic movement disrupted the hollow silence left in the wake of the severed bond. He lunged forward, placing himself between Elise Thorne and the heavy oak doors leading out to the courtyard. The rain beyond the threshold continued its freezing assault, blowing cold droplets across the entryway, but the Alpha seemed oblivious to the dropping temperature. His broad shoulders, usually squared, with the heavy arrogance of unquestioned pack authority, were now hunched and uneven. The tailored fabric of his ceremonial coat hung awkwardly across his frame, ruined by the sweat and physical collapse of the prior moments. He raised a hand, his fingers shaking, reaching toward the empty space between them. The gesture was a fractured mirror of the dominance he had wielded just an hour ago at the judgment pillar. Now it was a desperate, grasping plea. The words he spilled into the quiet hall were a disjointed stream of rationalizations, frantic promises, and fractured apologies. He spoke of the council's pressure and how the forged evidence had blinded him. His voice cracked, stripping away the low, commanding timbre the territory had obeyed for years, leaving behind the thin, reedy sound of a man who realized he had dismantled the foundation of his own house. Elise did not stop walking. She maintained her steady, measured pace, her posture perfectly aligned, her chin parallel to the ground. She did not raise her hand to ward him off. She did not brace her muscles for an impact. The geometry of her path was absolute, a straight line drawn from the center of the tribunal floor, directly to the open courtyard doors. She did not look at his face. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the grey daylight spilling through the archway, focusing on the sharp contrast between the dark interior stone and the silver rain falling outside. The air in the hall thickened with the collective breath of the watching pack, waiting for the inevitable collision. Garrick stood in her immediate trajectory, his outstretched palm hovering merely inches from her collarbone. A single step more, and she would walk directly into his chest. In the old days, she would have yielded without a second thought. She would have stepped to the side, lowering her head, making herself small to accommodate the physical mass of her alpha. Today, she did not even shift her shoulder. She took the next step with the exact same even rhythm as the last. The leather soles of her shoes clicked against the masonry, sharp and precise. The physical reality of her unyielding momentum forced Garrick to confront the void where his authority used to reside. The mate bond was gone. There was no biological compulsion demanding her submission, and there was no fear left to replace it. Faced with her absolute icy indifference, the man who had sentenced her to die flinched. His heel caught the edge of a raised floorstone as he stumbled backward, hastily clearing a path to avoid being walked through as if he were nothing more than a ghost. His outstretched hand hung suspended in the empty air, grasping at the cold draft blowing in from the open doors. Elise walked right past him. She did not turn her head to acknowledge his presence, nor did she accelerate her pace to escape him. He had simply ceased to be a variable in her calculations. The worst part wasn't the desperate apologies echoing off the high-vaulted ceiling. It was the complete, unbroken silence that followed in her wake, rendering him utterly irrelevant. The courtyard was a sea of freezing mud, churned by the heavy boots of the Imperial Guard and the earlier panic of the execution assembly. The driving rain had washed away the chalk marks drawn around the judgment pillar, leaving the stone slick and bare. High King Valerius Sterling waited near the open door of the royal carriage, his dark velvet cloak shedding water in steady rivulets. He did not issue commands to hurry her along, nor did he offer a hand to guide her down the slippery steps. He simply occupied the space beside the transport, holding a large, oil-treated umbrella to shield the entrance, providing a safe, dry threshold without demanding a physical toll for the protection. Elise descended the stairs, her movements still carrying the deliberate, analytical grace that had just dismantled a regional conspiracy. As she approached the carriage, Valerius stepped back, allowing her completely uninterrupted access to the interior. The sovereign's respect was entirely structural, defined by the boundaries he deliberately chose not to cross. He waited until she had fully settled into the deep leather seat before folding the umbrella and taking his place on the opposite bench, keeping the entire width of the carriage floor between them. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, instantly severing the auditory chaos of the storm and the distant shouting of the broken alpha. Inside, the temperature was warm, generated by a small brass brazier bolted securely to the floorboards. The cabin smelled of dry cedar wood, melted beeswax, and the crisp, clean scent of fresh parchment stacked neatly on a fold-out traveling desk. The carriage lurched forward, the heavy iron-rimmed wheels gripping the gravel path as the draft horses leaned into their harness. Through the rain-streaked glass, Elise watched the fortress recede. Garrick remained a small, dark shape, kneeling in the ruined earth, entirely swallowed by the grey northern downpour. She watched him until the shape became indistinguishable from the shadows of the outer wall. Then simply looked away. Feeling the tension drain from the back of her neck, she ungloved her right hand, placing her bare palm flat against the tufted upholstery of the seat. Her fingers traced the smooth, dry leather, cataloguing the texture, the warmth, the undeniable material proof of her current reality. The friction of the material grounded her. For months, she had quietly catalogued inventory in the coldest room of the keep, tracking numbers and medicinal supplies while remaining completely invisible to the hierarchy that consumed her labor. Now, she was moving toward the center of the High Kingdom, recognized not for a rare biological marker, but for the meticulous accuracy of her work. Valerius did not ask if she was comfortable. He did not attempt to fill the quiet cabin with unnecessary reassurances. Instead, he unclasped a heavy leather portfolio from the desk, withdrawing a blank ledger bound in dark iron clasps. He set a glass bottle of standard, unregulated black ink into a brass holder and laid a fresh quill across the pristine page. She had survived the corrupt machinery of the pack because her innocence was not an emotional plea, but a documented fact. Tomorrow, she would organize the imperial archives. Tomorrow, she would verify the royal taxes and ensure that the truth was permanently recorded. And for the first time in a very long time, she breathed in the scent of dry ink and knew exactly where she belonged.